A desolate wasteland was basking in the blinding light of high noon. The sun was like a small silver coin in the azure sky, melting as its rays bathed the world in heat and radiance. The shadows were small and formless, hiding under the rocks and rusting carcasses of ancient war machines. 3 gargantuan gates towered above the wasteland, facing each other. Each formed an apex of a triangle, and there was considerable distance between them. One of the dream gates was dark and nebulous, ripping the world like an inky black rift. The second one was pure and radiant, shining like the sun. The last one was like a mirror, reflecting the wasteland back upon itself. No one was here, in the ravaged heart of the eastern quadrant, to witness them, no one except for the millions of figures who stood still under the cruel rays of the blazing sun, covering the wasteland behind the mirror gate like a vast sea. Some of them looked like humans, while some looked like nightmare creatures. Of course, all of them were a single being. Mordred, the King of Nothing. As the sun moved across the azure expanse of the boundless sky, the shadows slowly crawled out of their shelters. The darkness of the shadow gate seemed to flow forward, too, then, it surged and swelled, and a tenebrous legion rose from its lightless depths. Tens of thousands of shades marched onto the wasteland, with several titanic figures lumbering among them like dark giants. The Shadow Legion assembled into a flawless battle formation, facing the King of Nothing and his myriad vessels silently. Finally, a sole figure appeared from the sun gate, landing on the ground in front of it like a radiant spirit of pure light. Her beautiful wings folded, and her brilliance dimmed, revealing ivory skin and hair that was like a torrent of liquid silver. Regarding the sea of vessels with an aloof expression, she took a step forward and walked to the center of the triangle formed by the 3 dream gates. Of course, she was Nephi's of immortal flame, changing star, the ruler of the human domain and the guiding star of humanity. Almost at the same time, a figure rose from the shadow of the second gate. It was a young man with porcelain skin and raven-black hair, with eyes so dark that they almost seemed like 2 glistening onyx gemstones. He was sunless, the Lord of Shadows, the Sovereign of Death. He headed to the center of the triangle as well, and everywhere he passed, the shadows seemed to grow deeper. And finally, a third figure appeared out of the rippling silver surface of the mirror gate. It was a tall man with a slender figure and strange eyes that reflected the world back upon itself, wearing the tattered remains of a stylish Viridian suit. Smiling easily, he folded his hands behind his back and went to meet the other 2 sovereigns. He was Mordred of Nowhere, the King of Nothing. Slightly past noon, the 3 demigods met on the scorched sands of the barren wasteland in the eastern quadrant. Sunny was the first to speak. He studied Mordred for a few moments, then looked at the millions of motionless vessels behind him and smiled darkly. My, oh my. I did not think we would meet again so soon. I guess congratulations are in order? Mordred looked, a little eerie, really. There had always been something subtly unnerving about him, a vague sense of wrongness caused by the absence of something that all humans were supposed to possess, but now, a new layer of inexplicable strangeness was layered on top of that. It was as if Mordred was even less related to anything human than he had been before. As if he was a myriad of broken shards that had been a person once hiding under human skin. Why thank you, Sunless. Mordred smiled and inhaled with a full chest. Ah, it feels good to be king. In an utterly unnerving display of unity, the millions of vessels behind him all smiled at the same time. Sunny struggled to maintain a composed expression, feeling a cold shiver making its way up his spine. Never thought there would come a day when I'll see nightmare creatures smiling. Granted, their attempts at mimicking Mordred looked more like frightening snarls than the pleasant smile playing on his lips. Nephi spoke at that moment, her even tone showing no sign of being disturbed by the eerie scene. You should be feeling it by now. The laws of this realm rejecting you, pushing you out. So, let us not waste time on meaningless pleasantries and get to the point. She was right. Staying in the waking world for a short while was not impossible, but they were weakened here. More than that, it was straining. The longer Sunny lingered, the more the pressure on him mounted, and the harder it was to push against the walls of the world that seemed to want to crush him. It was easier to do for Nephi, who shared an inherent connection to both worlds, but only relatively. All that meant was that she could return more often and stay for longer, not that she wasn't affected in the same way. Actually, there was no telling what relationship Mordred had with the waking world, the war realm. After all, he had inherited the lineage of war god, and more than that, his powers had to do with mirrors. As someone who reflected the world in front of him, he could possess an inherent advantage when it came to adapting to its laws. Then again, he could be having it as rough as Sunny. Mordred chuckled. What is the point, changing star? Are you two going to attack me? Nephi stared at him evenly. At first glance, it looked like they had gathered here to fight. However, the millions of vessels, the Shadow Legion, and the 3 Dream Gates, it was all just for show. A statement of their power and a silent reminder of what would happen if they were to clash. In truth, the continent would probably not be able to endure the harrowing forces unleashed by a battle between 3 supremes, and with its fall, the entire ecosystem that allowed humans to survive on Earth would inevitably follow. That was why they had chosen to meet here, in a place that rejected them and suppressed their power. When Nephi did not respond, Mordred smiled. I thought not. A wise decision, after all, there is no reason for us to become enemies. Sunny glared at him silently for a few moments. Tell that to the survivors of the House of Night, bastard. And to the numerous people who suffered when the naval navigation in the waking world all but collapsed in an instant. Mordred considered him for a short while, then grinned. The proper address is Your Royal Majesty, King Mordred, not bastard. Please, have some decorum. His expression suddenly turned pitiful. And if I might add, is it not in bad taste to call someone a bastard after having made them an orphan? Ah, how callous. How cruel. He let out a laugh and then looked at Sunny with an amused smile. As for the House of Night, what exactly am I being accused of? What happened was their own fault. The elders of the House of Night could have submitted to the Song domain of their own free will and become honored vassals of the Queen. Instead, they chose their own pride and arrogance. They committed the gravest sin of all. Updated first on lightnovelworld.org. Mordred's gaze turned cold. They were weak and tried to hold on to something that they couldn't protect in a world that doesn't tolerate weakness, let alone arrogance. So, they brought it all upon themselves. He shrugged. Plus, I merely removed the elders, or rather, replaced them. There was some collateral damage, of course, but most of the ascended and awakened members of the House of Night, the actual Nightwalkers who guide the ships across the ocean, survived. Mordred sighed. Ideally, I would have accepted them back into the fold after the war. The House of Night would have become the House of Nothing, with little disturbance to the infrastructure of the waking world. Even the power of the saints would not have been lost, since I'd be wielding it. So, don't paint me as some kind of mad monster. He smiled. I am a very reasonable monster, if nothing else. Sunny glared at him darkly. Ah, how aggravating. He couldn't even erase that irritating smile from Mordred's face. Nephi finally spoke, breaking the tense silence between them. I've been told that trying to make you regret your actions is a meaningless endeavor, Mordred. So, I won't try. However. She looked at him calmly. The 3 of us are supreme. I do not want to repeat the mistakes of the previous generation and embroil humanity in another civil war. We sovereigns must find a way to coexist instead of fighting each other. I doubt that you want to be destroyed, and since you have attained supremacy without the help of the nightmare spell, there is no reason for us to fight for territory either. So, let us negotiate. Mordred studied her for a few moments, then smiled. Ah, finally. A civil discussion. Goodness gracious, how refreshing, sure, changing star. Let us negotiate, indeed. Sunny did not like the idea of negotiating with Mordred at all. Not because he was particularly inflexible and wanted to kill the bastard no matter what, although the idea of cleansing the world of Mordred did seem amazingly alluring, but simply because he knew from experience that striking any kind of deal with Mordred was a dangerous gamble, at best. The chances of being betrayed were too high. Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, wait, how many times have I been fooled by this damned miscreant? He frowned, then looked at the sea of motionless figures standing behind the mirror gate. A chill ran down his spine again. Sunny had felt an inexplicable sense of unease ever since beholding the eerie sight of this silent myriad. Truth be told, he did not even know if the Mordred he knew and the creature standing in front of him were the same being. By now, they knew that Mordred had attained supremacy in the process of battling the Skinwalker in a soul duel. That was how he was able to inhabit millions of vessels and destroy the Great Terror. Granted, even Cassie was not clear on which came first. The cause and the result were too closely intertwined to be discerned. Perhaps, in this case, they were one and the same. Regardless, Mordred had somehow managed to manifest a domain encompassing no one but himself, which went against the very idea of supremacy. The authority of a sovereign was supposed to be expressed by exerting it upon something. After all, be it living beings or territory, even that was not a problem, though. The problem was just how many vessels Mordred now possessed. It was simply beyond the realm of reason. If Sunny did not confirm it himself, he would have confidently stated that it was completely impossible. He knew the pressure of trying to separate his mind across tens of thousands of conduits better than most, after all. And as shades weren't even true incarnations, he could only perceive the world around them and issue commands, not control them directly as he would his own body. Even that had put an enormous strain on him before he acquired Mind Weave, and mere weeks after acquiring Mind Weave, he was already struggling with maintaining his previous sense of self. All that stemmed from having to split his attention between every shade of the Shadow Legion, and Mordred possessed millions of vessels, not merely thousands. Even Qi Song had not been able to control such a staggering number of puppets. Even Soul Stealer, a version of Mordred twisted by corruption, had been driven mad by shattering himself into a million pieces to consume Twilight. But Mordred did not seem mad. At least he was not madder than he had been before. He did not seem quite human either, though. The face was the same, if made even more sublime by the rebirth of rising to a higher rank, and the manners were the same, too. But there was something unfamiliar hiding in the depths of Mordred's gaze. How would having millions of bodies change someone's consciousness? Especially if that someone had a tenuous claim to personhood, to begin with. Sunny did not want to show the subtle feeling of being disturbed by this new and unfamiliar Mordred. One thought disturbed him even more, though. Is something similar happening to me and Nephice? It was an eerie thought. In any case, as much as Sunny did not like the idea of negotiating with Mordred, they had little choice. Despite all his deviousness and complete lack of remorse, Mordred could try to downplay the hideousness of the massacre he had perpetrated upon the House of Night all he wanted, and it would still not convince anyone. He was a sovereign now. And a sovereign could never be treated lightly, least of all one wielding a divine aspect. Sunny and Nephice could probably destroy him and his millions of vessels, but they would not escape that battle unscathed. At best, they would be severely weakened, which could prove fatal before too long. There was another sovereign they had to worry about, after all. There were 4 supremes in existence now, and one of them was almost certainly both hostile and a dire threat. So, as long as it could be avoided, they had to make sure that Mordred joined the battle against Asterion, and, ideally, the war for the future of humanity, on their side. Updated first on lightnovelworld.org. So it was not just that destroying him would cost them too much. They had little reason to destroy him, to begin with, or at least more reasons to keep him alive than to kill him, as long as Mordred could be reasoned with. And as much as Sunny wanted to deny it, Mordred had told them the truth. He was a very reasonable monster, indeed. He had betrayed and fooled Sunny a few times. But he was not a pathological schemer. He had fulfilled his promises quite faithfully when it suited him. In the Tomb of Ariel, for example, he had played a key role during the final battle at Verge. A battle in which Sunny himself had not participated, having betrayed and abandoned his friends. Damnation. It's driving me insane. Sunny looked at Mordred, sighed, and asked in a resigned tone. What exactly is it that you want? He had an idea. Mordred had already expressed that he needed Sunny and Nephice, for no other reason than to be his meat shield against the Dreamspawn. Now that he was the king of nothing, that seemed like more of a strategy than before. For no other reason than the fact that a sovereign could contend against Asterion, while a saint couldn't. At least Mordred had not seemed to believe that he stood a chance. Neither had he believed that Sunny and Nephi stood a chance. Therefore, their usefulness as cannon fodder had an expiration date. That, in turn, would mean that Mordred expected Asterion to defeat them eventually, and therefore had to have a plan for what was going to come next. Now, the outline of that plan was starting to take shape. Mordred was going to attack. The world, even two worlds, seemed to be too small for two supremes, as long as one of these supremes was Asterion. So, Mordred had to have an intention of destroying the Dreamspawn eventually. Not only because he believed that he would have to in order to survive, but also because he hated Asterion almost as much as he had hated the King of Swords. He just needed Sunny and Nephi to buy him time. Mordred smiled. "What do I want from the two of you?" "Well, in one word, nothing. Absolutely nothing." He laughed. Mordred's laughter echoed above the wasteland. Then, it suddenly turned into a haunting, deafening roar. That was because the millions of vessels behind him all laughed, as well. That scene was so otherworldly eerie that Sunny could not help but grimace. "Cut the theatrics, will you?" Mordred chuckled once more, then looked at them with a faint smile. The sea of motionless figures behind him grew still, as well. Nephi shook her head. "Saying that you don't need anything from us is a bit of an exaggeration, isn't it?" She looked behind him, at the horde of vessels, some of them human, some of them monstrous. Among the humans, there were a number awakened, but most of them were mundane. They were the ordinary citizens of the Eastern Quadrant taken by the Skinwalker in the past, only for their bodies to be stolen by Mordred in the end. "If nothing else, you will need a place to settle. Now that these vessels belong to you, they will be banished from the waking world before too long, and every area of the dream realm that is not a death zone currently belongs to us. So, unless you want the sea of vessels to come into a shallow pond, you will have to find a place for them to live." Mordred let out a wistful sigh. "A place to call home, is it? What a wonderful sentiment. Why, this is indeed something I would not refuse, so, how about you give me the storm sea?" Nephi tilted her head a little. Out of the question. It was indeed impossible for them to surrender the storm sea to Mordred. Not only because there were 24 citadels there, almost half of them conquered by Mordred while impersonating the elders of the House of Night, but it was also the connective tissue between the former territories of the Song and Sword domains. Except for the Road of Shadow far north, in Godgrave, it was the only way to travel between the two parts of the human domain, unless one made use of a dream gate opened by a supreme who ruled Night Garden. Mordred sighed. "How disappointing, and after I spent so much effort conquering those citadels, no less." He shook his head, then smiled. "You seem to think that you have the upper hand in these negotiations, Changing Star, but let me remind you of something. In truth, I don't really need a region of the dream realm to settle my vessels. So, you have nothing to offer me. Your hand is empty." Nephi frowned and studied him for a few moments. "The mirror realm." Mordred chuckled. "Indeed. You do remember, after all." In fact, Sunny remembered too. It was just that neither Mordred nor Nephi remembered that he had been there with them, as well. It had happened back in Twilight, when Mordred pulled them into Soul Stealer's mirror realm. His own only encompassed the reflection of his soul sea at the time, but the minor mirror domain of Soul Stealer encompassed the reflection of the entire city. Now that Mordred was supreme and his domain had fully manifested, there was no telling how vast and lifelike his mirror realm was. Vast enough for millions of vessels to inhabit, perhaps. I'll be damned. Mordred was not just a one-man nation. He seemed to be carrying an entire kingdom within himself, as well. And every mirror could become a door to that kingdom, a door that only he could open. Nephi shook her head. Updated first on lightnovelworld.org. Most of your vessels are fragile and mundane. They will need to be fed, sheltered, clothed, and cared for. Even if you have a space to store them, you won't have the resources to keep them alive, not without vast hunting grounds and trade routes. Not to mention that you will want to expand your domain by usurping more bodies. She smiled faintly. You are not reckless enough to plunder my people, so you will have to hunt down nightmare creatures. Therefore, you will still need a territory to call your own. Mordred sighed. Goodness. Fine, I will admit it. I do indeed want to control a territory in the dream realm. But not just any territory will do. Something was telling Sunny that Mordred would not demand to receive Bastion. What piece of land does he have his eyes on? Mordred believed that Asterion was coming, and that the human domain, as well as the shadow domain, would eventually fall into his hands. He was also prepared to wage a war against Asterion and destroy him. So, in other words, Mordred was preparing to wage war on the human domain. Just not yet, not while it still belonged to Nephi's. This insane bastard. In that light, it made a lot of sense why his first choice was the Storm Sea. If one wanted to launch a military campaign against all of humanity, there was no better option. Not only did the Storm Sea wash over the southern shores of both human enclaves in the Dream Realm, it was also nebulous and difficult to navigate. With his knowledge and experience of sailing its misty waters, Mordred would be able to launch unexpected attacks all along the coast, as well as use the estuary of the River of Tears to advance north rapidly, almost all the way to Ravenheart. He would also be able to storm Rivergate for the second time and reach Bastion in a matter of days, if not hours. Best of all, he would be able to retreat into the mists of the Storm Sea after each raid, saving himself from Asterion's retaliation. The House of Night had existed for so long without being protected by a sovereign in large part because invading the Storm Sea was an inherently dangerous endeavor. It was almost impossible to conquer it unless you felt at home in its deadly, nebulous waters. It was a perfect fit. So perfect, in fact, that Sunny could not help but suspect that Mordred had always kept the eventual return of the Dreamspawn in mind, and aimed his sights on the House of Night in large part for that very reason. However, it was for that reason as well that Nephi and Sunny would never let the newly risen Supreme usurp the Storm Sea. What other region of the Dream Realm could compare, though? What other place could serve Mordred's goals? He smiled. Give me the Hollow Mountains, then. Mordred wanted the Hollow Mountains. Well, it was no surprise that he did. All the reasons why the Storm Sea suited his goals applied to the Hollow Mountains, as well. The mountain chain stretched from east to west, bordering the human territories on both sides of Godgrave. The endless expanse of white mist shrouding the jagged peaks made it all but impossible to invade them, while those who could survive its cold embrace were free to launch unexpected raids on the lands south of the mountains. Or north of them. That was where the Forgotten Shore, Sunny's lightless kingdom, was located. In addition to that, Mordred had an affinity to the source of the white mist, to nothing. So, he would have an easier time surviving there than almost anyone else. Of course, his aspect had to do with mirrors and reflections, which were kin to nothing creatures, but not exactly the same thing. In a sense, the Hollow Mountains were to Mordred what the Shadow Realm was to Sunny. Perfect hunting grounds that were as full of promise as they were perilous and deadly. Granted, that only encompassed the surface of the hollow peaks, not the dark depths inside them, the underworld. Out there, in the realm of true darkness, Mordred would be just as helpless as Sunny. After all, there could be no reflections without light, so his powers would be rendered useless. Mordred seemed to be getting exactly what he wanted. However, Sunny and Nephi had no reason to refuse him, or at least no reason that was good enough to deny him the Hollow Mountains. They themselves had no use for them, and there were no human colonies being built within the mist. All in all, things could have been worse. A new sovereign had risen from the ranks of humanity, and while he was not exactly a reliable ally, he was not inherently hostile either. Mordred might have been a monster who knew neither regret nor remorse, but he did not usually act without reason. Otherwise, it would have been the entire population of EQSC consumed by him instead of the Skinwalker. On the bright side, humanity had another supreme now, and an immensely powerful one at that. If there was one predictable thing about Mordred, it was that he always acted in self-interest, and in the grand scheme of things, his interests coincided with those of Sunny and Nephi. After all, the destruction of their world was imminent. Once Earth was fully consumed by the dream realm, everything that was not corrupted would be besieged by the nightmare creatures, including those fallen deities of the cursed and unholy rank. When that happened, Mordred would have little choice but to fight side by side with other human sovereigns in order to survive. Sunny understood that rationally. But, still, negotiating with the bastard was exceedingly frustrating. I want to rip that damn smile off his face. He had dismissed the Shadow Legion. The endless sea of Mordred's vessels was disappearing into the rippling surface of the Mirror Gate, too. They were entering the Mirror Realm, leaving the desolate expanse of the Eastern Quadrant behind. Mordred himself was still here, though, looking at them with a polite smile. Yes, I do agree. We should continue this conversation in a more comfortable setting. Updated first on lightnovelworld.org. His smile was the same, but his face betrayed subtle signs of fatigue. The war realm was straining to expel them, and by now, the pressure was crushing. On top of that, Mordred had only recently concluded the dreadful battle against the Skinwalker and undergone the evolution to supremacy. He had not had the chance to rest and recover yet, so he was in rough shape. The negotiations were far from being over, of course. They had only set out the very fundamental principles of their future coexistence, so the details would have to be decided later, in the presence of people who could formulate a proper treaty. It was not a question of authority, but merely of convenience. Mordred would need building materials and a steady supply of clean drinking water and food to establish his kingdom in the Hollow Mountains, for example, since it was going to take him some time and a lot of effort to make it self-sufficient. Therefore, some kind of trade agreement would have to be established, and Sunny and Nephi's were not the best people to define it. There were countless small details like that. There was the question of what they would be getting in return, as well. And above all else, they were not going to agree on anything with Mordred unless Kai was present in the room, and could confirm that the King of Nothing was being sincere in his willingness to, if not cooperate, then at least coexist with the human domain. So, he was invited to Bastion. The negotiations would continue on the Ivory Island, with most members of the cohort, as well as a team of relevant professionals, present. As for Mordred, he did not have a cohort, close companions, or talented subordinates. Therefore, he would have to oversee the entire process himself. I can believe this is my life now. Sunny blinked a couple of times, thinking that he had never expected to negotiate a trade agreement with Mordred one day. Life was, indeed, full of surprises. They were also going to discuss the dream spawn in more detail then. Granted, Mordred did not seem too keen on the idea of cementing an alliance to deal with Astarion. Despite everything, he was entirely convinced that Sunny and Nephi's were a lost cause. So, he wasn't inclined to help them understand what his former caretaker was capable of. All knowledge Mordred possessed would have to be exchanged for something. That was what Sunny and Nephi's were getting in return for building materials and food supplies, above all else. Well, then. I'll depart first. Mordred gave them a perfunctory bow and vanished without a trace. His dream gate disappeared, as well, leaving Sunny and Nephs alone on the desolate wasteland. Sunny studied the landscape around them for a long while, and then suddenly laughed. I realized something just now. He looked at Nephi's and shook his head in disbelief. This is now the safest place in the world. Both worlds, really. The Eastern Quadrant had been ravaged by war. The peculiar thing about the Skinwalker, however, was that the Great Terror did not discriminate between people and nightmare creatures. It took every vessel it could find, striving to grow and spread as much as possible, no matter whom it consumed. And while humans were still resisting the dreadful fiend, the nightmare creatures populating the wilderness of the Eastern Quadrant had all been wiped out and absorbed by the Skinwalker some time ago. Their bodies were then inherited by Mordred, who took them into his mirror realm. So, at the moment, the Eastern Quadrant was the only place in either of the worlds that was completely void of abominations. There were still nightmare gates here, of course, which meant that new monsters would wander through them sooner or later. But, for now, this continent was completely safe and cleansed of corruption. Like all continents used to be. Nephi remained silent for a while, then sighed. Indeed. It is quite ironic, isn't it? Although his motivation was entirely selfish, Mordred had done a great service for humanity. He saved an entire quadrant, and maybe much more, considering that the Skinwalker was on the verge of evolving. Sunny let out a bitter laugh. You are right. He did something that neither of us had managed to do. Mordred, of all people. Nephi possessed great power, but that power was largely straightforward. Sunny wielded a subtler aspect, but he still could not have eradicated the Skinwalker without shattering the entire continent. Even then, a few vessels would have survived and hidden themselves somewhere else, so that plague would have begun spreading in a different corner of the world before too long. But Mordred possessed a power that was uniquely suited to destroying creatures of exactly that kind. By challenging the Skinwalker to a soul duel, he had destroyed the very root of the Great Terror without the need to annihilate each and every one of its vessels. And now, a sudden realization hit Sunny. The war is over. A lion's share of humanity's forces were currently concentrated in the Eastern Quadrant, mundane soldiers and awakened alike. The same went for saints. Even Jet was here, as well as the Night Garden. Now, all these people had nothing to do. The military forces would have to be relocated to other flashpoints, some here on Earth, some in the Dream Realm. All of this had happened so unexpectedly that there was no plan in place. Many strategic meetings would have to happen to adjust the resources of humanity according to the new reality. There was the question of the evacuation, as well. The population of the Eastern Quadrant was currently being evacuated to other quadrants and the Dream Realm. Now, the primary reason for that exodus was gone. Were they going to stop the evacuation and abandon plans of leaving the Eastern Quadrant, or continue to ferry people away? The Dream Realm was waiting, after all, and everyone would have to abandon the waking world sooner or later. There were many things to decide. Sunny could already feel his head hurting. Nephi gave him a guarded look, and then suddenly asked, "Do you think that we really are no match for the Dreamspawn too?" She seemed to be displeased and somewhat uneasy because of what Mordred had said. Aster, Song, Vale. These were the three names that had defined her childhood. Song and Vale were dead now, but Aster remained. More than that, Nephi now knew that, in large part, she survived because Asterion had held the other two sovereigns back and prevented them from trying to dispose of her too openly. Not out of concern for her or some twisted shape of sentimentality, but simply because he had needed her to awaken to harvest the lineage of Sun God. Sunny pursed his lips and considered his words for a while. Eventually, he sighed. The Dreamspawn seems to possess powers that have to do with mind manipulation. Among all the nightmare creatures that I've faced, those that mess with your mind were absolutely the worst. So, I do believe that dealing with him will be a troublesome affair. Sunny's expression darkened. I guess what I am trying to say is that we should not be expecting a clean victory. This one, we will have to bleed for this one, I think. He paused, then looked at Nephi and asked, "What do you think?" She studied the desolate landscape around them for a while, then shrugged. It is as you said. It will be a tough fight, and we will not win it without paying a price. But, we will win it. I believe it. Sunny nodded. Updated first on leghtnovelworld.org. So do I. I don't think it's going to be very pleasant, though. He shook his head dejectedly. What was it with Supremes and fighting each other instead of focusing their ire on the nightmare creatures? Out of the 7 sovereigns born from humanity up to this point, 3 had already perished, and all 3 of them had been killed by other Supremes, not by powerful abominations. Broken Sword, Key Song, and Anvil. Asterion would join them eventually, and by then, not just some, but most human Supremes would have fallen to a human's blade. Children of war, indeed. Perhaps Yuri's had a point in disliking Sunny and his kind. Looking at the oddly tranquil landscape of the Eastern Quadrant, Nephi inhaled deeply. Perhaps she was thinking about how this was her eventual goal, a world free of the nightmares. Perhaps she was simply thinking about the mountain of decisions she would have to make regarding the relocation of her armies. Turning to the Radiant Dream Gate, Nephi looked at her shadow, where a different incarnation of Sunny was hiding, and then back at him. We should return to Bastion. Are you coming? Sunny hesitated for a little while, then smiled. No. I think I am going to catch a ride with Jet. She is going to take the night garden back to Stormsea soon, isn't she? Nephi studied him for a moment, then nodded and headed toward the gate. Don't fall into a coma this time, please. If you don't mind. Sunny smiled as he turned the other way. I can't say that I won't, but I will definitely try.